Here we're going to look at the properties of the sine and cosine graph. We're going to start by examining the period. And by period I mean that the length over which it takes for the graph to complete one full cycle. The sine graph completes one full cycle in 2 pi radians. 2 pi radians also means 360 degrees. So the period there is 2 pi radians, or 360 degrees. We can also see that a cosine wave takes the exact same amount of space on the x-axis to complete one period. So 2 pi or 360 degrees. The amplitude is the distance from a peak to the middle line of the graph. And what I mean by the middle line of the graph is this horizontal line that bisects the wave, so cuts the wave into two, right here. Drawing it in green, which is more or less visible there. As we can see here, the amplitude of this graph is 1, and it's the same for the cosine graph. So the amplitude here is 1, and the amplitude for there is 1. The maximum of this graph is 1, and the minimum is -1, and the maximum of this graph is the same thing. It goes all the way up to 1 and comes back down all the way down to -1. Now, if we were to look at the entire domain of this function, like what are all the possible x values in the sine and cosine graph? Well, they're both the same, and that is x is an element of all real numbers. It's continuous along the x-axis. Same thing with the cosine graph. It's all real numbers of x. The range, however, we can see the maximum is 1 and the minimum is -1 down here. Right? Again, with the amplitude being 1, we can see that the amplitude is an absolute value, which means that it's always positive. We're just looking at the magnitude, right? The range right there would be y is an element of all real numbers such that y has to be greater or equal to -1, but it has to be less than or equal to 1. Same thing with the range in this case as well. There is a restriction whereby y has to be contained and including the values between -1 and 1. And so those are the properties of the sine graph and the cosine graph. One thing that should be noted here is that the cosine graph really is related to the sine graph, in that the cosine graph is like the sine graph except shifted left 90 degrees. So there's a relationship between the cosine and the sine graph, in that the cosine graph can be thought of a sine graph as being shifted 90 degrees. Okay, so there's a relation to be explored there. Thanks for watching.